Okay, thanks everybody, and welcome to another webinar. Today is Friday, October 7th, 2022. Somebody asked me why I always say the date at the beginning of these webinars, and I don't really know, but one possible answer is years ago, I was caught saying that everything I hear on CNN and Fox and MSNBC and all the rest of them is I consider to be either misinformation, disinformation, or outright lies. And then one day I was happened to see, I think it was Anderson Cooper, and he got on and he said the date. And I looked on my calendar, and sure enough, he was correct. So I had to correct myself that not everything they say is misinformation, disinformation, or lies, because in fact, that was the correct date. So if anybody ever accuses me of all those things, you can always point to the date and see if in fact I got the date correct. Because as far as I know, it is October 7th, 2022. So another thing that people have asked me is why continue a sort of dispute with the leadership of Children's Health Defense and other members of the so-called freedom community? And I think that's a good question because there is a pretty vitriolic exchanges going on and a lot of bad blood. And aren't we supposedly all on the same team here? So why is this going on? The first thing I want to say about that is I do appreciate how the contribution that the leadership in CHD has made to warning people about loss of freedoms and the dangers of the vaccines and many other issues. So I just want to be clear about that. In fact, I think if they didn't do that, nobody would be listening to them. And so none of this would actually be an issue. So that's the first thing. The second thing is I do appreciate the difficulty of the position that the leadership at CHD is in. They have an entire scientific so-called advisory board of people who are pushing the existence of the virus and the whole virus agenda, and specifically the lab-created virus and things like natural immunity versus vaccine immunity and pathogenic priming and all this stuff. And so to flip and give credence to the fact that all of that is anti-scientific nonsense, I can imagine that they would have a mutiny on their hands. And so this is a significant issue. I would just point out that I think all of us have been in a similar issue at various points in our lives, where we realize that we have maybe competing constituencies or people in our lives who simply do not see things in the same way. And so at that point, the question is, what is the way out? Now, to a certain extent, you can hope this goes away, which I think has been the strategy so far. The problem with that strategy is the fact that there actually is no virus, and viruses are not pathogens, is gaining momentum by leaps and bounds. And so the problem is their natural constituency is coming more and more on board with that. And so now they're in a real bind between a mutiny of their so-called scientific advisors versus the natural consistency of the people who follow them and support them, et cetera. And there's probably some fundraising questions involved in that too. And the reason I bring this up is because in my life, and probably in most of our lives, when we're in this situation, when you get right down to it, there's only one way out, and that's to follow the truth. In other words, do everything in your power, make every effort to find out what's true. Now, the fact that this is not seemingly the main agenda here, and before I say that, let me just point out that we're not talking about a peripheral issue. We're talking about the only issue, that is the existence of the virus and whether viruses are pathogens. That is the central issue in this tyranny of the last almost 3 years. We're not talking about an issue like managing the fertility of cats, which I didn't realize, but that is actually an interesting and huge issue, and one that I'm deeply interested in. But that's not what we're talking about. You could argue that that is a peripheral issue to the tyranny that we're facing and the restriction of our freedom. We're not talking about that. We're talking about the only thing that will stop this tyranny is understanding once and for all that the whole virus narrative is based on anti-scientific thinking and basically nonsense. And so when you're in that dilemma, you can try to ignore it and obfuscate, but ultimately the only way out is to just seek for the truth. And if you were seeking for the truth in this situation, the way you would do it is to make sure all voices are heard, all voices. In fact, you would not have to have the, quote, other side ask you to be heard. You would say, I want to seek out and make sure every possible voice is heard, especially if it turns out that 20, 30, maybe even 40, 50% of your constituents are sharing that opinion. And then you would make sure, since this is a scientific issue, you would go out of your way to make sure that every possible scientific avenue was explored. Every possible control experiment was explored, and you would advocate for that. So like I pointed out last time, I had conversation with an analytical chemist who talked about how easy it would be to find something in the sputum or in the blood or in the snot or in any biological tissue in a herpes blister of something so big and with the morphology and the chemical characteristics of what we're calling a virus. So if your only agenda was getting to the bottom of this and searching for the truth, why wouldn't you try to hire this person to look at how we do the experiments to find the virus in any biological fluid, as well as anybody else who had an opinion about how to do a control experiment that would make sure that every step of the way you were on sound, logical, rational, scientific ground. Why wouldn't you do that? Why wouldn't you try to control every step? Why wouldn't you welcome more and more experiments that try to prove this? Because instead of that, what we have is, no, we don't want to do these experiments, even though they can't say proper control experiments. They can't point you to a single study where they've been done. No, this is not our issue. We don't have to do this. Why not? That is not the attitude that anybody who's really interested in science would take. As Stefan has said over and over again, the first rule of a scientist is to try to do everything possible to prove yourself wrong. Why isn't that being done? The answer can only be that there's something else getting in the way. And once you get in this situation where you have two competing constituents who cannot possibly get along and you cannot possibly have a unifying conference, you have only one choice and say, screw it all. All I care about is getting to the bottom of what's real. I'm going to invite all the different opinions. I'm going to find out by doing every possible experiment that I can do. I'm going to support that and make sure that we get as close as we can to the bottom of this and finding out what's true. That's all I'm suggesting. Do the experiments, get the opinions. Let's air this out in a proper way by having our side, quote, explain ourselves in a systematic, reasonable, logical, scientific way. So I think that's enough of that. I did want to point out something, just to add something to this debate. This is on the subject of isolation, which we've been over 1,000,000 times. It's probably not 1,000,000 times. This is from the Perth group. And just to show you how obscuring the language is and how convoluted, because everybody knows that the first step in finding something, anything in nature, a tree, a frog, a bacteria, a credit card, whatever, you make a definition of what you're looking for. You go to its natural habitat, either a forest or a pond or your throat or your wallet, if it's a credit card. You make a definition, you go to the natural habitat, you use the tools of analytic chemistry and the modern technology of finding things if you can't see it or hear it or taste it or touch it. These things are well established. They can find things of orders of magnitude smaller and less complex than viruses and more volatile and unstable than viruses. That's what they're saying. Instead, we have definitions of, quote, isolation, i.e. finding the things, such as HIV expert Jay Levy says, virus isolation is taking sample of a virus from a defined source. White and Fremer has the ability to identify a totally unforeseen virus or even discover an entirely new agent. It's hard to even know what that means. Montagnier and Weiss are as, quote, propagating viruses in a cell culture. We already know about that. The 2013 sixth edition of Field's Virology defines isolation as, quote, viruses can be isolated from an infected host by harvesting excreted or secreted material, blood, or tissue and testing for induction of the original symptoms in the identical host or induction of some abnormal pathology in a substitute host or in a cell culture. Once the presence of a virus has been established, it is often desirable to prepare a genetically pure clone. So in other words, if you take stuff from somebody like blood or tissue, and you can make somebody sick in these similar symptoms, that somehow is isolation or proof of the virus. What if there's a poison in their tissues or blood? Won't that create the same symptoms? So are you saying that the poison is the virus? It goes without saying that if virus isolation is to, quote, take a sample of a virus from a defined source or propagating them in cells in culture, one first must have proof of the virus exists in a defined source or in cells in culture. Neither is virus isolation in, quote, induction of some abnormal pathology or once the presence of a virus has been established. You can just see the semantic gobbledygook. Nobody wants to say you go to the habitat of what you're looking for, make a definition, separate it from everything else, study it, find out if it does anything, and that's how we understand life. And this came from Mark Bailey's wonderful paper called Farewell to Virology. So thanks, Mark. Okay. Finally, and this gets to one of the questions I was asked. Why does this matter? It matters because of an article I happened to see today. This is the world that we are going to live in if we continue to believe in the existence and pathogenicity of viruses. All US-bound air travelers who I think came from Uganda will be tested for Ebola virus, the State Department said. They will be redirected to a handful of major airports for screening amid a growing outbreak in the African nation. There will be new layers of screening with questionnaires and examinations and temperature checks. And we're seeing quarantine camps, issues around monkeypox and pumpkin pox and all kinds of other poxes and Ebolas. It's just going to be an endless sea of biosecurity situations related to the presence or the scariness of these viruses. And while it's true that you could argue, well, these are unconstitutional, or maybe you can argue that they're unwarranted, you've got to admit that if there is this virus that's going to kill us all, it's not unreasonable to think that the government, assuming the government actually was interested in our well-being, should try to do something about it. And so then you're left in arguing whether the number of cycles of the PCR was done properly, as if the PCR process could detect a virus. But you've already admitted that the PCR process detects viruses. That's what all the existence of these viruses are based on, are sequences. And so you can only argue the constitutionality of this, or you could argue whether it's warranted, or maybe the threat is exaggerated and not as good as, and not as high as we think. And then maybe you win some, and then obviously you lose some. And you have to trust the national judicial system, which, as we all know, is not to be trusted. And so you're going to lose time and time again, and you're going to spend untold amount of energy and money and time fighting this until the end of time. And I personally don't want to live in a world of biosecurity based on the threat of imaginary viruses. And that's why we have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to get this right now. Why wouldn't a movement dedicated to truth and freedom take every advantage of this opportunity and full-throated endorsement of every possible way to see whether what we're saying is actually correct, instead of attempting to literally block our ability to make our case on your channels and not agree to endorse any tests or our tests that would prove whether this case is true or not. Okay. Probably enough of that. So let's get to the questions for today. Whoops. We already did that one. Questions. Here are the questions that I was given. So, number one, could you please talk about possible solutions for tinnitus? I'm going to have to get out of this to show something. So interestingly, when I get to trying to think about how am I going to understand and approach the symptom, the experience of tinnitus, otherwise known as ringing in the ears. What's the method that I'm going to use to try to make sense of this? And obviously, depending on the situation and depending on the symptom, there may be a different strategy that I'll use to try to ground myself in what's real. One of the things that I use, and I think is a valid way of doing this, is to find out in what situation do you see this symptom? In other words, is there some typical situation that you'll see the symptoms of tinnitus, ringing in the ear? And interestingly, one of the first ones that comes to mind, and this is something that I use a lot, is it turns out that one of the earliest symptoms, I don't remember where I got this from, but some online WebMD type thing, but I don't think it was WebMD. The earliest symptoms of acute aspirin poisoning may include ringing in the ear and impaired hearing. So that tells me, and I've actually seen this in patients, I've seen it in the ER, I've seen it when I was doing my internship, that people who have overdosed or even taken the therapeutic dose of aspirin, I remember for people with rheumatoid arthritis, we used to give them 15 to 30 aspirin tablets a day, and even sometimes tell them, or they were told by the rheumatologist, to take this until they got ringing in their ears. And then that was supposedly too much. So I think it's a pretty safe bet, which is the process that I'm talking about. If you're going to understand something, you have to make sure you're on firm ground. So the firm ground I'm talking about is if you want to say, if you want to put it another way, you want to give somebody tinnitus, just give them 30 tablets of aspirin a day, and they will probably get tinnitus at some point. So that, what does that tell you? It tells you simply that aspirin causes tinnitus. I don't know if that's a proof of that, but it's a pretty interesting relationship. Now, there's another one which most doctors will know about, which is a medicine, so-called antibiotic, that we've all heard about lately because it's used in cell cultures, and that's the antibiotic called gentamicin. And they say if gentamicin is administered inappropriately, a patient is likely to experience a condition known as gentamicin toxicity, also called gentamicin poisoning. What they fail to mention is that administering it inappropriately is actually administering it, because even if you administer it appropriately, you can see things like kidney damage and renal failure, nerve damage, and oto, meaning ear, toxicity. In other words, damage to the ear, hearing loss, vertigo, or ringing in the ear, otherwise known as tinnitus. Also, balance problem with memory, concentration, and oscillopsia. I didn't know that word, bouncing vision. So, in other words, we have pretty good evidence that poisoning with different pharmaceutical drugs, in this case, aspirin and gentamicin, causes ringing in the ear, or at least will produce the symptoms of ringing in the ear. So why is that? So what is ringing in the ear? Because if you don't know what ringing in the ear is and how it's created, then you obviously can't do anything about it. So the first thing we then say is it's, at least in certain situations, it's because of poisoning. So what happens when you're poisoned? I've been over this many times, and so maybe Tricia or somebody could put a link to different webinars where I've talked about what a nerve is. But a nerve does not have synapses. It does not have neurotransmitters, all those chemicals that are made following the nerve transmission, not causing the nerve transmission. There are no synapses. That's an electron microscope artifact due to dehydration and stretching of the tissue. And the electrical conduction is based on the fact that the water in the nerve is a gel which has free electrons, or at least what we call free electrons, and that's what flows, and that creates the instantaneous transmission effect, which is obviously what we see with nerve transmission. And so all of these drugs that produce tinnitus must have an effect of essentially changing the gel-like structure of your nerve into what I would call something like a puddle, or it could sclerose it and harden it so it's a hardened gel instead of a mesocrystal like Marcel Vogel talks about, which is the basis of all life. We are living liquid crystals, the nerves in particular. That's why they're the source of the electrical impulses, which is essentially the basis of what we call life. So if you put some sort of toxin in there, like aspirin or gentamicin, or there's lots of other ones, you will interfere with the ability of the nerve to maintain its structure, and then the nerve will send off abnormal signals to tell you that something is wrong. And for interesting reasons, it tends to happen in some kind of poisoning to the acoustic nerve. Now, why might that be? So the ear, interesting, is related to the kidney. This would be a long explanation of why that is, but you can even sort of see that grossly if you look at your ear, and I have one right here after I got my haircut, so you can see it a little better. That's not why I got my haircut, by the way. Anyways, it could be why. But the ear is shaped like a kidney, and in Chinese medicine, as far as I know, they relate the formation of the ear and the kidneys to each other. And so any medicine like non-steroidals like Motrin and aspirin and Aleve, et cetera, that clearly damage the structure of the kidney, gentamicin, as was pointed out in that little clip, is directly nephrotoxic. That's why administering it inappropriately means administering gentamicin to somebody who has obvious renal failure based on blood tests. Administering it appropriately means they seem to have normal kidney function and you're about to make it worse. So that's the appropriate administration of gentamicin. So once that happens, you interfere with the kidney function, and somehow that has a specific, kind of like a reflex action, and I don't really know how that works on the ear. And so that you specifically damage the acoustic nerve, meaning you destructure it, you make it into a puddle or into a sclerotic, hardened tube that neither of which can conduct electricity properly. And then that nerve sends out signals to tell you that it's been affected. And that signal is what we call tinnitus. Now, if you can understand all that, which is, I think, fairly simple and straightforward, and it could be a more subtle poisoning, a inappropriate diet or something in your water or electromagnetic fields, people have very creative ways of starving and poisoning themselves. But you understand that, like all diseases and all symptoms, this is a symptom of either or both starvation and poisoning. So the first step, which seems to have been all that's needed for most of my patients, is here's to show you what a genius I am. Stop starving and poisoning yourself. And that means eating the appropriate diet, like Nourishing Traditions, like I've been over many times. That is the diet for humanity. And going through your life and getting rid of all poisons that you can think of, including electromagnetic field poisons, which is another often usual and direct cause of ringing in the ear. Once you do that, in most cases, the ear will recover, the acoustic nerve will recover, and you'll end up not having the symptoms of tinnitus. If you need more intervention than that, you can do all the things that we've talked about to add a nutritional support. You can take bone broth that ends up helping the collagen supply, that ends up helping with the structure of the water. You can drink structured water. You can get out in the sunlight. You can go barefoot. You can get rid of all toxic EMF exposures, get rid of your devices, and do some sort of a detox program using either water fasting or some of the other various ways that we've talked about. In most cases, that should be the end of the tinnitus. Okay, let's move on here. Number 2, I've been reading about a flare-up of, quote, Ebola virus in Uganda. What is happening in this environment that's causing this to the extent that you may know? I must say, I don't know what's happening in Uganda. I know it's not a virus, and it's all these stories are just covering up for some other toxic influence that they're not telling us about. By the way, number 5, vertigo, is similar to tinnitus, so you can just say everything that I just said about tinnitus, apply it to vertigo. I was wondering if you could talk about the process of how they claim or actually create GMO seeds. And for those of you who've heard me talk about my skepticism of all things DNA and so-called genetic, I'm skeptical that these are actually genetically modified in the way that we think of these. They may just be some sort of hybrid creation where you culture some one organism with another or somehow mix them together without actually modifying the genetics. But I have to admit, I just don't know how they do it. I've looked into it, trying to find this out a little bit, and I can't get any clear idea of how a GMO seed is actually created. And until I know the actual process that is used, I don't know how they're actually making these or what they are. Okay, number 4, what's my opinion of CBD? So this is an interesting subject, and I would also say this is not something I would consider myself any way of an expert on. Not sure what I consider myself an expert on these days, but not CBD or cannabis. I've only actually had 2 exposures to cannabis in my life, and I won't go into those stories right now, but they were very influential. One thing I will say, though, is my wife in particular is a big fan of a woman, and I don't know her actual name, but she calls herself, or Slow Down Farm something. I think that's the right title. And because of an incident in her family that had to do with her daughter, she has actually looked into the situation of cannabis a lot. And she is a very interesting person to listen to. I can't say I've listened to her a lot, but the little that I have, I almost always like the way she thinks and like the way she approaches just about any subject. Her main point was the way that cannabis is grown and processed and used essentially bears no relationship to the old getting high that most of us, not me, did 40, 50 years ago. This is not naturally grown wild cannabis with its particular collection of chemicals. These are highly engineered, highly toxic agriculture techniques used. The whole thing couldn't be more artificial to create chemicals which have biological effects on human beings. And whenever I see that situation, I am skeptical that the biological effects are positive. Essentially, they're using all kinds of toxic chemicals, growing these plants under unbelievably abnormal conditions, creating a chemistry in the plant that, again, has nothing to do with the old pot plants that people used to have 40 years ago. And so the effect on us, on human beings, is completely different and not in a positive way. I hear today that there's going to be a federal push for legalizing or decriminalizing or something all cannabis all over the United States. And while those of you who've listened to me know that I'm not a big fan of putting people in jail for doing something that they chose to do or just about any other reason, the whole criminal justice system, is dysfunctional and corrupt and needs, we need a whole different way of doing government, et cetera. So I won't get into that. But this is not because the federal government is so interested in your health and well-being. This is because they probably see this as another industry and another toxic chemical that they can introduce into people's body under the guise of this must be good for you, and create all kinds of troubles which you don't need to have. And so I would tell people, until proven otherwise, every CBD product, every cannabis product on the market today is probably best avoided. And that is exactly what I do and tell those around me to do. The flare-up of Ebola, I already talked about. I was thinking of the mRNA particle and spike protein particles. If a virus cannot be isolated, can the mRNA or the spike protein be isolated, or are they phantoms as well? There was a good piece of La Quinta Columna did something on not being able to find any mRNA in these so-called vaccines. And the other thing that one has to realize, there may be and probably is a type of protein which is being called a spike protein. There probably is a kind of mRNA which one can find in various biological mediums. Neither of them have anything to do with a virus. Neither of them have been shown to come from a virus or have anything to do with the virus. So the question is not whether they exist. They certainly are not proven, as far as I can see, to be in these injections. And one of the ways that you can try to understand this is you would expect that if they're putting this mRNA product into these injections and protecting it with these lipid nanoparticles and all the rest of it, And so that it can make this spike protein, which can serve as the antigen, which you can make antibodies with your imaginary immune system too, so you will be protected. You would think there would be hundreds of studies showing the presence of the mRNA, this particular sequence, in any one of these so-called vaccines, and then hundreds of studies showing, a dose-related effect. If you put more mRNA, do you get more spike protein? Does it show up in your liver? Does it show up in your kidneys? Is it in your brain? Does it stay in your arm? Where is it? If you give more mRNA, do you get more spike protein? Or maybe you don't. Maybe you get less. That would be strange. But, we don't know until we do an experiment. This comes under the heading of something you can't predict this. You can't know this without doing an experiment. There's some things in life that you just can't know. You can maybe know if somebody loves you or cares for you, or whether a flower smells good or a certain way without doing an experiment. But you can't know what the effect of a certain amount of mRNA creates as far as the amount of a spike protein in your body. There's just too many factors that go into that, which you have no ability to sense or understand without doing an experiment. And yet, as far as we can see, there are no studies like that showing the pharmacodynamics, the relationship of mRNA and how much spike protein. So until that, which seems like a bizarre omission. So on what basis are we saying that this alleged mRNA sequence, which when people look, supposedly can't find, creates this protein in us? On what basis is that been proven? So the whole thing seems to be a cover-up to convince us that there must be a spike protein. The spike protein must come from a virus. So that's how we're going to protect you, by having you make antibodies to this protein, which either doesn't exist, which it probably does. There is probably a protein like that, but it has nothing to do with the virus, immunity, or protection from anything. Okay, number 8. Do you have a recommendation for hemorrhoids? Obviously, this has a lot to do with diet. And I sometimes, let me just get out of this for a minute. Yeah. Let me go back. I've been over this before, but hemorrhoids are one of those bowel diseases. I think everybody knows what hemorrhoids. There's a joke about hemorrhoids that the king was asking for, king of some place, I don't know what the place was, I'll probably get the joke wrong, was asking for a number of things so that he could be a better ruler for his people. And one was wisdom, so that he could make better decisions. And I don't remember what the second one was, so I'll make it up, like adequate finances, so he could take care of the material needs of his people. And the third was hemorrhoids, so that he could have a look of concern. So that's what you need to know about hemorrhoids. Now, the question of hemorrhoids is related to the question of bowel health. And I've been an interested student of bowel health for, well, probably 50 years. And at some point decided to look into it. And I've asked a lot of people the question, give me one word that a person needs to be exposed to in order to have good bowel health or perfect bowel health, which, of course, includes hemorrhoids. And the interesting thing about this is everybody knows the answer, from the head of gastroenterology at Duke to the guy in the street. What do you need in order to have perfect bowel health? Answer: fiber. All right. So next question. How do you know that having adequate fiber or a lot of fiber is the recipe for having good bowel health? So there, almost nobody knows the answer. But it turns out the fiber theory of bowel health was formulated or inaugurated by a guy named John Burkitt, who was a surgeon who lived in West Africa. He was I believe, a friend and contemporary of Albert Schweitzer. And both of them lived and worked in West Africa as surgeons for decades. And they both noticed that none of the people in traditional African villages had any kind of bowel disease. They never had an appendicitis. They never had colon cancer. They never had gallbladder stones. They never had Crohn's disease. They never had ulcerative colitis. They never had hemorrhoids. And even interestingly, they didn't have a word for constipation. If they were asked, what do you do about constipation? They would say something like, what's that? It would be sort of like asking an elephant, what do you do about constipation? And most elephants, I don't think, would know what you're talking about, because obviously that can't happen to an elephant. Elephants in the wild eating proper elephant food never get constipated. So why would they have a word for it? Same with the traditional Africans. So Burkitt was also the famous guy. Burkitt's lymphoma was named after Burkitt. So he got pretty well known for a bunch of things. He decided to look into this. And so he began to study the fiber content of various villages and different tribes and compare that with Western Africans, the Africans who lived and ate the food in the city. And he found, sure enough, that the Western Africans, in fact, did have all the typical Western bowel diseases, including hemorrhoids and constipation, whereas the Africans eating their traditional diet didn't. And he wrote this up, and he said the difference was the amount of fiber, that the traditional Africans ate a lot of fiber, and I don't know the exact milligrams, and the Africans living in the cities on a Western diet had much less fiber, and that's the reason why they don't have good bowel health. Now, I used to ask people, doctors and other people who believed the fiber theory, did you ever read John Burkitt's paper? Because I actually did. And one of the things, and most everybody says no, but I think you can still find it somewhere. And one of the most interesting things about the paper is one of the people that he mentions in the paper were the Maasai tribe in East Africa. They live in Kenya area, maybe Tanzania. And the interesting thing about them is they also had perfect bowel health. And I don't know if anybody wants to guess how much fiber they eat, but basically the answer is 0. The only foods they actually eat are blood, milk, and meat. Although it's actually not technically correct to say they eat milk, because Africans almost uniformly will never drink just fresh milk. They always culture it. And in fact, they cultured, fermented, you could use either word, a lot of the blood and some of the meat and all of the milk. And in fact, so the interesting thing, and this gets into even the heart of science, why would he write this paper saying it was fiber when he had an example that proved that fiber was not the answer? And if he had just acknowledged that there was a discrepancy in his data with the conclusion that he came to, he might have actually found that it turns out that pretty much all Africans, I would say all traditional Africans, because of their circumstance, which is they live in a hot climate and they had no refrigeration, that they always processed and stored and kept their food because of fermentation. That's how they preserved their food. So they became the masters of fermentation. And even if you go to Nourishing Traditions, you will see recipes like ogi, which is fermented millet, and they fermented all, different, just about everything. Their sweet potatoes or roots, whatever they were that they were eating, they drank fermented, quote, beer. They fermented all their dairy products. They even sort of fermented their meat in certain ways, dried it and fermented it. They were the masters of the fermentation, and it's the fermentation that healed their bowels and made it so they didn't have good bowel disease. Interestingly, the connection with fiber is, I would now say it isn't that fiber is bad for you. It's the fiber it can be a good source of food for the healthy bacteria that you're consuming something like 40-50% of your diet. So in other words, the African diet was almost 40-50 or some high percentage was fermented food. They were basically a healthy culture medium. And one of the foods that can be used for culturing or growing the bacteria, it's not the only one. You can use milk and you can use meat, but you can also use fiber, and that creates a nutrient source, a food source for healthy bacteria. So that was the connection with fiber. So the main recommendation for anybody suffering from hemorrhoids is to obviously do like the Africans and start fermenting your food. And, I've been doing this for over 30 years probably. And at some point, I have probably 20-30 or so percent of my food is fermented or cultured in some sort of way. We do fruits, we do drinks, we do herbs, we do dairy products, we do vegetables, probably other things as well. So we eat that every day with every meal. I put it in my soup. I have it with dinner. Every meal I have fermented food and fermented drinks, beet kvass, all the rest of it. There's also an herb which I found remarkably effective for sort of the mitigation or treatment of hemorrhoids, which is called Collinsonia root. I believe it's also called stone root, which is another name for hemorrhoids. And the best place to get this is Standard Process. They sell it plain, I believe, and they also sell it with something called gastrofiber, both of which will, along with a fermented food diet, will keep you from ever having a problem with hemorrhoids again. Okay. Let me just do maybe one more. Yeah, Gerald Pollack, when he talks about ways to encourage easy water in our cells, he doesn't mention that you structured before with Flaska or Analemma. Shouldn't the body in its infinite wisdom know exactly how to structure the water we drink? I actually would say yes. And I agree with Gerald about this. We shouldn't necessarily, I would qualify it, need to drink structured water, that the body in its infinite wisdom, you're right, knows how to structure it as long as we have sunlight and earthing and infrared light and grounding and saunas and all the rest of it. we should be able to structure all the water in us. I would say, though, that traditionally, people only were exposed to structured water in the first place. And I also think it probably makes it easier if you're drinking structured water. And then the final thing that convinced me that while it may not be necessary, there are actually studies, and if you interested, go to the interview I did a couple of years ago now, I think with Dolph Zantiga, the founder of the Analemma wand, that simply drinking water that you have stirred with this wand has a clear beneficial effect, not only on certain parameters of aging, it has beneficial effect on plant growth, on animal health. Animals will gravitate more toward water that has been stirred with an Analemma wand. The same thing, I think, goes for Flasca. You can see the difference in the crystallization structures of the water before and after. It also seems to have a interesting detoxification effect on the water, because when you make easy water, it excludes things that cannot be integrated into this gel or this crystal, and they typically get evaporated or at least neutralized. So it seems like, even though I would agree that we should be able to structure all our water if we have the right conditions, like is said here, there certainly seems to be a case that making it a little easier for yourself is not a bad idea. And that is just recreating the conditions of all the water that people used to be exposed to, which was primary water coming directly out of the earth through springs. Okay, so I think we've done enough for today. Thanks, everybody, for joining me. I hope you have a great weekend, and I will see you next Wednesday.